April 7, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The fuel hose clicked as it disconnected from the Grumman F4F Wildcat, a metallic sound breaking the quiet while Second Lieutenant James Elm Sweat settled into his cockpit. He had no idea that the next 15 minutes would turn him from an ordinary working man into an American legend. His hands, still calloused from years of working with marine turbines in his father's San Francisco shop, held the control stick with surprising steadiness for a man about to fly his very first combat mission. The radio crackled to life with words that would change everything. Condition red. Condition very red. 150 Japanese aircraft were coming from the north. Every pilot on Guadalcanal knew what that meant. The largest enemy air raid since Pearl Harbor was only minutes away, and standing between those bombers and the American fleet were 76 Allied fighters, scrambling desperately to gain altitude. Among them was a 22-year-old former industrial worker who had never fired his guns in real combat, never seen an enemy plane except in training films, and never felt the chaos of aerial warfare. What none of the Japanese pilots knew as they came, in their carefully planned formations, was that they were about to face a mix of natural talent, precise training, and pure instinct that would create one of the most amazing combat performances in aviation history. James Elm Sweat was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington. He was the first of 3 children of George Elm Sweat and Nellie Emily Burns Sweat. His father, George, was an electrical engineer and Marine Corps reservist who had started a company making marine pumps and turbines. When James was young, the family moved to San Mateo, California, where George built his business in the San Francisco Bay Area. The company focused on maritime industrial equipment, the unglamorous but important machinery that kept ships running and harbors working. Young James grew up surrounded by gears and valves, horsepower calculations, and pump designs. He went to San Mateo High School, where nothing about him suggested he would become a hero. After finishing in 1939, James went to the College of San Mateo, the local junior college that was the highest level of education most working-class families could afford. College life gave James something unexpected. The federal government, preparing for possible war, had started the civilian pilot training program to create a reserve of trained pilots. The program paid for part of the flight training for college students. James grabbed the opportunity with excitement. Flying came naturally to him. The same mechanical understanding that helped him work with pump systems also worked perfectly for flying airplanes. He flew solo quickly, improved fast, and by the time he finished the civilian program, had 450 hours of flight time. That experience would be very important. Most naval aviation cadets had much less flying time during training. James arrived at military flight school with more experience than many of the instructors. The world situation got worse through 1940 and early 1941. Europe was burning under Nazi conquest. Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia. On August 26, 1941, James Elm Sweat joined the United States Naval Reserve as a seaman second class and started flight training in September. He was 21 years old, leaving the comfort and certainty of his father's business for the unknown challenges of military flying. Flight training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas, showed what the civilian program had suggested. James Sweat had natural flying skill combined with great discipline. He finished training in early 1942, ranking in the top 10% of his class. That rank gave him a choice most cadets never got. He could take a commission in the Navy or transfer to the Marine Corps. James chose the Marines. On April 1, 1942, exactly 1 year before his famous mission, Second Lieutenant James Elm Sweat received his commission and his gold wings as a naval aviator. He was 5'11", tall, weighed 154 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. Nothing about how he looked suggested the warrior he would become. Advanced training followed at Quantico, Virginia. Then carrier training aboard the USS Wolverine on Lake, Michigan, and finally tactical training in San Diego, California. The Marines were training pilots for the brutal air combat of the Pacific. The training focused as much on surviving as on winning. Stay fast. Dive away. Never turn with a zero. Use your wingman. Save ammo. Aim carefully. These lessons were taught by instructors who survived early disasters at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island. They knew what worked and what got pilots killed. In March 1943, Second Lieutenant Swett sailed to the Southwest Pacific on the escort carrier USS Nassau. The journey took weeks, first to Hawaii for more tactics training, then onward to the combat zone. Veterans told stories of non-stop Japanese attacks, pilots flying 4 missions a day, and losses so bad that whole squadrons were wiped out in weeks. When VMF 221 arrived at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides in late March, the pilots got their final briefing before moving forward. Swett was assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 221, VMF 221, part of Marine Air Group 21, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. The squadron had earned its reputation defending Wake Island in December 1941, where 4 Wildcats and their pilots had fought heroically against huge Japanese forces. Now rebuilt with new pilots and planes, VMF 221 flew from Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to join the ongoing air campaign. Henderson Field showed American determination. Built first by Japanese construction crews in July 1942, it had been captured by the 1st Marine Division on August 7th and defended against non-stop Japanese attacks for 8 months. The airfield was basic by any standard. A single runway of steel planks, revetments made of sandbags and palm logs, tents for maintenance. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Heat and humidity were unbearable. Malaria was everywhere. Yet Henderson Field was maybe the most important place in the Pacific War. Allied planes from Henderson controlled the waters around Guadalcanal and stopped Japanese reinforcements. Controlling Henderson meant controlling the Solomon Islands. Controlling the Solomons meant protecting the supply line to Australia. Everything depended on that one muddy runway and the men who flew from it. James Swett spent his first weeks on Guadalcanal, learning combat operations without ever seeing the enemy. VMF 221 flew patrols constantly, but Swett's squadron never made contact. He flew regular missions, got used to his plane, built teamwork with his fellow pilots, and waited. The waiting ended in early April 1943, when Allied intelligence spotted worrying Japanese preparations. Recon planes photographed huge groups of enemy aircraft at Rabaul, Bougainville, Kahili, and Balali. Japanese radio traffic went up sharply. What the Americans were seeing was Operation Wigo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's air counterattack meant to stop Allied advances. Yamamoto gathered nearly 350 planes for the mission, taking fighters and dive bombers from 4 aircraft carriers to add to land-based forces. The first major attack was set for April 7, 1943, aimed at ships and planes at Guadalcanal. Yamamoto sent 67 ID-3A dive bombers, codenamed VAL by the Allies, with 110 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters as escorts. The total formation was 177 planes launched from bases over 400 miles to the northwest. The raid was planned in 6 groups. 2 fighter sweeps would come first. Then 4 waves of dive bombers would attack in exact timing. Japanese leaders expected great success. American intelligence saw the buildup but could not know the exact time. Coast watchers, brave Australians and New Zealanders hidden on Japanese-controlled islands, gave early warning. On the morning of April 7th, recon planes saw signs of the coming raid. At 12:26 p.m., Coast Watcher reports of the approaching planes reached Guadalcanal. By 2:00 p.m., with the raid almost here, Henderson Field broadcast condition red. Every available fighter was ready for launch. At noon, Second Lieutenant James Swett led his division of 4 Grumman F-4F Wildcats on a normal combat patrol over the Russell Islands, 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The patrol was quiet and uneventful. After 2 hours in the air with fuel running low and no enemy in sight, Swett led his division back to Henderson Field. They landed around 2 p.m. and taxied to the revetments. Ground crews quickly began hand-pumping aviation fuel into the Wildcats' tanks. Each plane needed 117 gallons. The process would take at least 30 minutes. Swett climbed down from his cockpit, stretched his cramped legs, and got ready to wait. Then everything changed. The operations officer made a fast decision. Launch everything. Partially fueled planes were better than planes sitting on the ground. Swett was still standing next to his Wildcat, Bureau number 12084, when the alert sounded. Ground crews shouted at him to get in. The fuel hose was pulled from his wing tank, spilling precious gasoline onto the steel planks. Around him, 76 Allied fighters were scrambling for altitude. 36 F-4F Wildcats from Marine squadrons, 9 F-4U Corsairs, 6 P-40 Warhawks, 12 P-38 Lightnings, and 13 P-39 Airacobras. Every fighter within range was being thrown into the air to face the coming Japanese armada. The Wildcat that Swett flew was America's first-generation carrier fighter, already getting outdated but still deadly in skilled hands. The F-4F carried 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing with 240 rounds per gun. Total ETFB ammo load was 1,140 rounds, giving about 18-20 seconds of continuous fire. The Wildcat's limits were well known. Maximum speed 318 meters per amp at 19,000 ft. Climb rate about 900 ft per minute in perfect conditions. Combat-loaded planes climbed slower. Turn radius was worse than Japanese fighters. Range limited to 700 miles. The aircraft was slower and less agile than its main opponents in almost every way. What the Wildcat had was durability and firepower. The frame could take heavy battle damage and keep flying. The 50-caliber guns hit much harder than the lighter guns on Japanese planes. American pilots learned to use these strengths with tactics that focused on diving attacks, helping each other, and pulling away rather than long-turning dogfights. Swett pushed his throttle forward and felt the Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 twin Wasp engine roar at full power. 200 horsepower spun the 3-bladed propeller, pulling the Wildcat ahead. The fighter accelerated slowly, heavily loaded with fuel and ammo. It needed every foot of the short runway to reach flying speed. At 70 mph, Swett pulled back on the stick, and the Wildcat lifted reluctantly into the air. He raised his landing gear. He raised the landing gear by hand, cranking the retraction handle 30 times to fold the wheels into the wing recesses. This took his right hand off the throttle for almost 30 seconds, while his left hand controlled the plane. It was a tiring procedure right after takeoff, but every Wildcat pilot had done it hundreds of times before. Once in the air, Swett joined his 3 wingmen and began the desperate climb for altitude. Japanese dive bombers would attack from 15,000 to 20,000 feet. American fighters needed to reach that height or higher. The Wildcat climbed slowly, painfully slowly, for pilots who knew enemies were approaching at 300 meters at about 1,800 feet per minute in combat conditions. Reaching 15,000 feet took nearly 9 minutes. Around Swett, the sky filled with climbing American fighters, all racing upward, all fighting against time. Below him, Sweat could see the waters north of Guadalcanal. Tulagi Harbor held American ships, 3 cruisers, several destroyers, cargo ships, tankers, and support vessels. Thousands of American sailors had no idea that 177 Japanese planes were coming to destroy them. The radio crackled with reports, coast watchers tracking the raid, fighter directors coordinating the intercept, pilots reporting positions and altitudes. The controlled chaos of aerial combat in 1943, before advanced radar, before modern command systems, relied on eyesight and voice radio alone. Around 2:15 p.m., at 14,000 feet over the Russell Islands, Sweat saw them. Dark specks in the sky to the northwest, growing bigger fast. Dozens of planes in tight formations, more than Sweat had ever seen or imagined possible. The whole Japanese raid stretched across miles of sky, organized into precise elements moving with terrifying determination. Sweat keyed his radio. "Tally-ho, bandits, 12 or high. Multiple bogeys." His voice stayed steady, hiding the fear twisting in his stomach. Fighter director responded, "All fighters engage. Good hunting." That was it. No fancy tactics, no careful coordination. Just engage. 76 American fighters against 177 Japanese planes. Sweat rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn, aiming for the dive bombers. His wingmen followed, keeping formation despite the chaos around them. Below and ahead, he could see the Iched 3A Val dive bombers flying in neat formations. The Vals were single-engine planes, each with a crew of 2 and carrying a 1,000-pound bomb. They were outdated, slow, and vulnerable, but deadly if they hit their targets. Sweat picked 3 Vals that had drifted slightly from the main group. He positioned his division above and behind them, preparing for a classic overhead dive attack. The Japanese rear gunners could see him coming but would struggle to hit a target diving at high speed. At 350 meters, Sweat pulled out of his dive right behind the trailing Val. The Japanese plane filled his gun sight, growing from a small shape to a clear target in seconds. The distance closed. 200 yards, 150 yards, 100 yards. Sweat pressed the trigger. His .50 caliber machine guns erupted all at once. The sound was deafening even through his leather helmet. The Wildcat shook from the recoil. Tracer bullets streaked toward the Val. The first burst hit the Val's fuselage and left wing. Pieces of metal tore away from the Japanese bomber. The rear gunner stopped firing. The Val began smoking, then caught fire, and finally exploded in midair. First kill. Sweat had no time to think, no time to celebrate. He was already aiming at the second Val, which was desperately trying to escape. The Japanese pilot dove toward the water. Sweat followed, keeping his Wildcat behind and slightly above, firing short, precise bursts. The second Val caught fire and went down. 2 kills in less than 30 seconds. Sweat pulled up hard, looking for the third Val. The Japanese pilot had seen his companions destroyed and was trying to flee. Sweat climbed after him, using energy from his dive to keep up the chase. The Val was slow, barely 200 millimeters in level flight. The Wildcat closed steadily. At 100 yards, Sweat fired a long burst. The Val exploded, raining debris into the ocean below. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in his first 90 seconds of combat. 3 bombers that would never reach American ships. But Sweat had become separated from his division during the attack. His wingmen had gone after different targets and were now scattered across the sky. He was alone in the middle of the largest air battle in the Pacific War so far. As Sweat climbed back toward the main fight, American anti-aircraft fire from the ships below opened up on everything in the sky. The gunners could not tell American planes from Japanese ones at that altitude. They fired at everything moving, filling the air with exploding shells and shrapnel. A burst of fire hit near Sweat's left wing. Shrapnel punctured the wing and damaged the aileron. The Wildcat suddenly became harder to control, needing constant pressure on the stick to stay level. A less skilled pilot might have pulled out. Sweat checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, engine temperature normal, flight controls still working despite the wing damage. He was still able to fight. The choice took seconds. He would keep going. Ahead and below, Sweat saw 6 more Vals heading toward Tulagi Harbor for their attack run. These bombers flew in a loose line, following each other toward the target. They were now separated from their fighter escort because of the strong American interception and flew unprotected. Sweat dove on them. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. Diving from above and behind, with the sun at his back, Sweat closed in on the last bomber in the line. He got less than 100 yards away and opened fire. The Val exploded immediately, its bomb detonating from the gunfire. Sweat flew through the debris cloud, his windscreen temporarily covered by smoke and fragments. He pulled up slightly, aimed at the next target, and fired another burst. The second Val burst into flames and fell away. Sweat moved carefully up the enemy line, firing short, steady bursts, saving bullets, and making every one count. Each Val he destroyed was one less bomb falling on American ships. The fourth Val was harder to bring down. Sweat's ammo was almost gone, so his bursts were shorter. He got within 50 yards, close enough to see the rear gunner shooting wildly, close enough to see the scared face of the Japanese pilot. Sweat fired till the Val caught. Fire and fell into the sea. 4 more kills, bringing his total to 7 enemy planes destroyed. Sweat was now an ace, having shot down 5 or more planes in about 15 minutes. It was almost unheard of, but Sweat was not done yet. Ahead, he spotted one last Val trying to reach the ships flying very low over the waves. Sweat dove after him, his damaged Wildcat slow to respond. He came up behind and aimed, pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. His guns were empty, all 1,440 rounds, used in about 15 minutes of battle. Now he faced an enemy bomber with no ammo. Most pilots would have turned back to rearm and return to fight. But James Sweat made a different choice. He kept chasing the Val, even with empty guns, diving straight at the Japanese plane, trying to scare the pilot into pulling away. The rear gunner did not scare. He fired non-stop at Sweat bullets, hit the Wildcat again and again. The front glass shattered, cutting Sweat's face. Blood ran into his eyes. Blinding. His engine started coughing and making rough noises. Bullets had hit. Vital parts. Oil pressure. Dropped. Temperature. Climbed. The oil cooler was leaking. The strong Pratt and Whitney engine that had carried him through the fight was dying. Sweat broke off and turned toward Henderson Field, hoping to reach land before the engine quit. The Wildcat shook and jerked as it lost power. Black smoke poured from the front. Oil covered the glass, so he could hardly see. He was 15 miles from Henderson Field, flying a badly damaged plane, bleeding from his face, and knowing the engine could die any second. Below him lay Tulagi Harbor and Florida Island. If the engine failed, he would have to crash in the water near the harbor. He might be rescued. Fast, but in open ocean, he would likely die. The engine decided for him with a loud grinding sound of metal. The propeller stopped, and the Wildcat turned into a glider. Sweat had maybe 2 minutes of flying time left. Before hitting the sea, he adjusted his controls for best glide speed about 110 miles per hour and searched quickly for the safest place to land. The water near Florida Island looked calm enough. No big waves in sight. If Sweat could ditch the Wildcat correctly, if it didn't flip or break apart on impact, he might survive. The final seconds demanded perfect technique. Sweat manually lowered the landing gear to act as a water brake. He opened his canopy so he could get out fast. He tightened his shoulder straps to avoid being thrown forward. Then he prepared to hit the water at exactly the right angle and speed. Too steep, and the Wildcat would nose under. Too shallow, and it would skip and tumble. The right angle was maybe 5 degrees nose up, touching down at minimum controllable airspeed. At 50 feet, Sweat pulled back slightly to bleed off extra speed. 40, 30, 20, 10. The Wildcat's tail hit first, just as planned. The plane slowed violently as drag increased. Sweat was thrown forward against the straps with crushing force despite having tightened them. His face slammed into the instrument panel, his nose breaking with a loud crack. Pain exploded across his face. The Wildcat settled into the water and immediately began sinking. The heavy engine dragged the nose down. Water rushed into the cockpit through the open canopy. Sweat needed to get out in seconds, or he would go down with it. He grabbed his seatbelt buckle, fingers slippery with blood. The buckle released. He pushed up from the seat. His parachute harness caught on something inside. He was trapped. Water rose fast, already up to his chest. Cold seawater mixed with blood stung and burned. Sweat yanked desperately at the harness, trying to free himself. It stayed caught. The Wildcat sank faster, pulling him down. Water reached his chin, mouth, nose. He was underwater, trapped in the sinking fighter, drowning in 10 feet of water after surviving 15 minutes of intense combat. His lungs burned. Vision darkened. Sweat gave one last desperate heave, pulling with every ounce of strength. The parachute harness tore free. He pushed up and out of the cockpit, swimming toward the surface he could not see. His life vest should have inflated but had not. Maybe damaged by shrapnel. Maybe fouled by the harness. He could not reach the surface. Muscles failing, lungs empty. Then suddenly, the life vest activated. The compressed gas cartridge fired, expanding instantly, lifting Sweat toward the surface. He broke through, gasping and choking, sucking in air. Blood and seawater ran down his face. His nose throbbed. His face burned from cuts. His chest ached from the impact against the straps. But he was alive. He had survived. Around him, the air battle raged on. Aircraft dove and climbed overhead. Guns chattered. Bombs exploded in the harbor. Ships fired anti-aircraft weapons in a continuous, unrelenting barrage. Within 15 minutes of Sweat reaching the surface, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him floating in his life vest. The crew pulled him aboard, gave him morphine for the pain, and treated his wounds as best they could with the limited combat first aid supplies available. Someone handed him a bottle of Scotch whiskey. He drank gratefully, feeling the alcohol burn down his throat, warming his shocked and exhausted system. The Coast Guard boat delivered him to Tulagi Harbor, where he was immediately transferred to the Naval Hospital at Guadalcanal. Doctors carefully examined him, cleaned and stitched his facial lacerations, set his broken nose and checked for any internal injuries. Remarkably, aside from the facial wounds and the fractured nose, Sweat was essentially unharmed. No other bones were broken, and no internal damage was initially detected. The morphine dulled the pain to a level he could manage. After treatment and initial recovery at the Naval Hospital over the following days, Sweat received visits from squadron mates and intelligence officers. Multiple witnesses had observed his relentless attacks on the VAL formations. Other pilots confirmed seeing his repeated diving attacks with precision and courage. Anti-aircraft crews aboard the ships had watched his sustained assault on the enemy bombers with astonishment. The intelligence officer's assessment was unequivocal. Second Lieutenant James Elm Sweat had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft confirmed in his very first combat mission. The assessment made Sweat an instant ace, one of the rare ace-in-a-day pilots. More importantly, Admiral Mark Miter, commanding Naval Aviation Forces in the South Pacific, personally nominated Sweat for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation would proceed through official channels, but Meader's nominations were rarely rejected. After recovering sufficiently, Sweat returned to VMF 221 and resumed flying operations. The squadron was converting from F-4F Wildcats to the newer F-4U Corsair, a significantly more capable and faster fighter. Sweat checked out in the Corsair during a brief rest period in Australia, and then returned to the Russell Islands in May. On June 30, 1943, now promoted to first lieutenant, Sweat provided critical air cover for the Allied landings at Renova Island. During that mission, he shot down 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty medium bombers and shared credit for destroying a Zero fighter with another pilot. 11 days later, on July 11th, near New Georgia Island, Sweat shot down 2 more Bettys while defending his wingman from attacking Zeros. He then destroyed a Zero, pursuing his wingman's Corsair, preventing what would have been a certain kill. But Sweat failed to see a second Zero positioning behind him. The Japanese pilot's cannon fire struck Sweat's Corsair, damaging the engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, James Sweat found himself attempting an emergency landing. This time, there was no Coast Guard boat nearby. He was over open water, far from friendly forces, with an engine losing power and leaking fuel. He managed to ditch the Corsair successfully, exiting the cockpit without major injury, and inflated his life raft. He floated alone in enemy-controlled waters, hoping for rescue before Japanese forces found him. 2 local Solomon Islanders in a small canoe spotted Sweat several hours later. They were native islanders who served as scouts for Australian coast watchers. The islanders pulled Sweat into their canoe and paddled him to their village. From there, he was transported by a larger 10-man canoe for several hours to reach an Australian Coast Watcher's station hidden in the jungle. The Coast Watcher, an Australian serviceman living behind Japanese lines and radioing intelligence to Allied forces, coordinated with Allied command for Sweat's evacuation. A PBY Catalina flying boat landed in a sheltered bay the next day and retrieved Sweat. He was returned to the Russell Islands exhausted but uninjured. The Coast Watcher network and local islanders had saved countless Allied lives during the Pacific War. Sweat owed his life to their courage. The islanders received compensation of $14 worth of calico cloth and canned beef, a modest payment that Sweat later said was inadequate recognition for saving his life. In October 1943, Sweat flew missions over Bougainville, engaging Japanese aircraft defending the major airbase at Kahili. He shot down 1 Zero confirmed and damaged another as a probable kill. In November, he added 2 more Valdive bombers to his tally. He also engaged a Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter, though intelligence officers could only confirm it as probable rather than confirmed destruction. By December 1943, James Sweat had flown 103 combat missions and accumulated 15 confirmed aerial victories. He was 23 years old. On October 10, 1943, while Sweat was still in the combat zone, Major General Ralph Johnson Mitchell, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, presented First Lieutenant James Elm Sweat with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony held at Espiritu Santo. The citation recognized his extraordinary heroism on April 7, 1943, when he unhesitatingly led his division against a superior force of enemy bombers. He personally destroyed 3 aircraft during his initial dive, then boldly attacked 6 additional enemy bombers after being separated from his division, shooting down 4 more despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and returned fire from the bombers that damaged his aircraft, shattered his windscreen, and wounded him before he successfully ditched his fighter in the water of Tulagi. The Marine Corps decided Sweat needed rest. He departed the combat zone on December 11, 1943, and arrived in San Francisco on December 31st. He was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara, California, to train new pilots preparing for Pacific deployment. In spring 1944, First Lieutenant Sweat traveled to Washington and met President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House during a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked informed questions about the Corsair and combat tactics. Sweat found the president genuinely interested. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, far longer than scheduled, because Roosevelt kept asking follow-up questions about Pacific air combat. By late 1944, Sweat was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California, where VMF 221 was training for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. The squadron was equipped with F-4U Corsairs and assigned to provide close air support for landing forces. Every pilot knew Operation Olympic would be the bloodiest campaign in history. Then, in August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Operation Olympic was cancelled. VMF 221 had ended the war ranked second among all Marine squadrons with 185 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, Sweat commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 141 Flying Corsairs at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, VMF 141 was deployed to Korea, but Sweat was left behind. The Navy had made a policy decision that Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Sweat protested vigorously, arguing that he should lead his squadron. The Navy was unmoved. Frustrated, Sweat left active duty around 1950 and continued service in the Marine Corps Reserve. He would eventually retire in 1970 with the rank of colonel, having served 29 years. Sweat returned to San Francisco and went to work in his father's company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. The business George Elm Sweat had founded in 1920 was still operating, still building the essential machinery that kept maritime industry functioning. James, now Colonel Sweat in the reserves, returned to the machine shop he had left 12 years earlier. The calluses on his hands, worn smooth during his years of flying, gradually returned as he worked with pumps and valves and turbines. In 1960, George Sweat died, and James inherited the company. For the next 23 years, he ran the business his father had built, maintaining the same commitment to quality engineering that had sustained the company through the Depression and war years. He eventually passed the business to his son, continuing the family tradition. The pump company remained modest but profitable, providing steady employment and reliable products. Sweat moved to Trinity Center, California, in retirement, later relocating to Redding. He became a frequent speaker at schools where he shared not combat stories, but rather his beliefs about personal values, respect, responsibility, and citizenship. He talked about the importance of doing your job well, supporting your teammates, and maintaining your equipment properly. He rarely discussed killing enemy pilots. When students asked about combat, he emphasized teamwork and training rather than individual heroics. His message focused on duty, preparation, and collective effort. In 2006, the History Channel produced an episode of their series, Dogfights, recreating Sweat's April 7, 1943, mission using computer graphics. Sweat provided commentary for the episode, describing his actions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing mechanical engineering. The episode aired on November 24, 2006, and introduced Sweat's story to a new generation. Younger viewers found it difficult to reconcile the elderly man speaking calmly about the mission with the intense computer-generated combat they watched on screen. But that was precisely who James Sweat had been throughout his life. A man who did extraordinary things without considering them extraordinary. On January 18, 2009, Colonel James Elm Sweat died in a Redding hospital from heart failure after a lengthy illness. He was 88 years old. He was survived by his family, his legacy, and the memory of 15 minutes that had transformed an industrial worker into a legend. He was buried with full military honors at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Ego, California. The funeral was attended by hundreds, including surviving members of VMF 221, fellow Medal of Honor recipients, and representatives from the Marine Corps and Navy. Fighter aircraft performed a missing man formation flyover. A Marine Honor Guard fired a 21-gun salute. Taps echoed across the cemetery grounds. The American flag that had draped his coffin was folded with military precision and presented to his family. The story of James Elm Sweat illuminates profound truths about heroism and the character of the men who won World War II. Sweat was not a professional warrior descended from military tradition or educated at elite schools. He was a working-class young man from the San Francisco Bay Area who happened to possess natural flying ability and unshakable courage. His story was replicated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater. Farmers became tank commanders. Shopkeepers became bombardiers. Factory workers became submariners. America took ordinary citizens and transformed them into a military force that defeated professional armies that had trained for decades. The transformation was systematic and thorough, based on principles America understood instinctively. Provide excellent training. Supply the best equipment possible. Trust individuals to make decisions. Reward initiative and aggressive action. These principles, anathema to authoritarian military systems, produced combat effectiveness that totalitarian regimes could not match. The American military system produced thousands of skilled pilots and soldiers who performed at levels enemy commanders considered impossible. James Sweat shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on his first mission, not because he was superhuman, but because he was superbly trained, adequately equipped, and trusted to use his initiative. The decision to press an attack without ammunition was his alone, made in seconds based on training and instinct. This individual initiative, this assumption of personal responsibility without requiring permission, characterized American combat effectiveness throughout the war. Technology and training created opportunities for victory, but individual courage remained essential. Comparing production statistics reveals the industrial disparity that shaped the Pacific War's outcome. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 324,000 aircraft of all types. Germany produced approximately 94,000 aircraft total. Japan produced approximately 76,000 combat aircraft. American aircraft production exceeded the combined Axis total substantially, but numbers alone understate American advantages. American aircraft were generally more durable, carried more ammunition, possessed better equipment, and were maintained by better-trained ground crews supplied with unlimited spare parts. An F-4F Wildcat destroyed in combat was replaced within days. A Japanese Zero destroyed might not be replaced for months due to production bottlenecks and material shortages. American pilot training similarly emphasized quality over quantity. The United States trained approximately 193,000 pilots during World War II from over 317,000 cadets who entered training. Washout rates remained above 39% even during pilot shortages. The system prioritized quality, understanding that poorly trained pilots died quickly without achieving objectives. Japan was forced to reduce training standards as losses mounted. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours total flight time, compared to Sweat's 450 hours before enlistment, plus extensive military training. Japanese pilots died in their first missions, unable to survive against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. This created a death spiral where Japan's experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained, leading to declining pilot quality, higher losses, and accelerated decline. The United States maintained a constant output of skilled, confident aviators operating ever-improving aircraft, supported by an inexhaustible supply system. Even with these benefits, individuals like James Sweat confronted hostile fire and life-threatening danger. Bravery alone was not enough, yet remained vital. The nation James Sweat returned to after hostilities had been fundamentally altered by full-scale mobilization. The economy had surged from the doldrums of depression to comprehensive employment and rapid production growth. Entire sectors had emerged almost overnight. Citizens realized capabilities previously unrecognized. Returning combatants observed the combination of military might abroad and industrial strength at home, yielding unmatched prosperity. These capacities were interconnected. Facilities that assembled aircraft could also produce vehicles. Management skills coordinating wartime logistics could oversee domestic supply distribution. Engineering know-how applied to weapons could also be adapted for civilian goods. The country stood ready to exert economic influence globally. Sweat's pump enterprise embodied this trend. Modest in scale, locally managed, technically adept, and consistently profitable. Numerous similar firms across the nation manufactured components sustaining overall productivity. They were unglamorous yet indispensable. Sweat's choice to rejoin his family's firm reflected personal priorities. Fame had never been a goal. Recognition, like the Medal of Honor, was valued, but not central. His focus remained on meaningful labor, supporting loved ones, and community involvement. These practical ambitions mirrored those of countless returning veterans who quietly fostered post-war affluence. They resumed employment, nurtured families, fulfilled civic obligations, and avoided seeking special privileges. The so-called Greatest Generation earned distinction not solely through battlefield valor, but through collective commitment to constructive effort, responsibility, and forward-looking action. Sweat's educational talks stressed principles over combat exploits. He conveyed that achievement stemmed from diligence and preparation, security from competence, and respect from accountability. References to destroying adversaries were rare, limited to direct inquiry, with no celebration of aggression or lingering animosity. By the 1980s, public perception of the conflict had matured. The war was increasingly regarded as ethically straightforward, justified, and successfully completed. Veterans received recognition for their heroism, their efforts acknowledged, and sacrifices honored. This shift marked a departure from earlier eras, when World War II had been overshadowed by Korea and Vietnam. The memorial service for Colonel James Sweat in 2009 marked the conclusion of a life that spanned nearly 90 years, witnessing the transformation of the United States from Depression-era uncertainty to the preeminent global power of the 21st century. Sweat was born in 1920, a time when the country was still recovering from the First World War, and he died in 2009 when America had become the undisputed global hegemon. That transformation depended on the contributions of millions, yet individuals like Sweat were indispensable. His 15 minutes of combat on April 7, 1943, represented a small fraction of the enormous American war effort. Nevertheless, countless similar acts collectively overwhelmed Japanese forces. They confronted not merely skilled aviators, but an entire system designed to produce competent pilots, consistently supply them with superior aircraft, and support them relentlessly with logistics. This structure made heroism possible but did not generate it. James Sweat's choice to press the attack despite having no ammunition was a matter of personal decision, not systematic programming. His survival after ditching was a testament to individual resilience, not organizational design. His decades of post-war service reflected character traits shaped by upbringing rather than formal military instruction. The system provided the opportunity. Sweat supplied the courage and skill. Both were essential, yet neither alone sufficed. The story of James Elm Sweat resonates through generations because it exemplifies values Americans recognize as inherently their own: individual initiative rather than blind obedience, personal responsibility instead of reliance on authority, technical mastery over social standing, humble service instead of self-promotion, and quiet courage over bravado. Sweat embodied the millions of ordinary citizens who achieved extraordinary feats when circumstances demanded. He insisted he had merely done his duty, yet in performing it exceptionally, he and thousands like him defeated formidable enemies, protected civilization, and laid the groundwork for decades of peace and prosperity. The America Sweat defended in 1943 was imperfect. burdened with domestic challenges including racial segregation and economic inequality. Yet it also offered hope for oppressed peoples worldwide, rewarded merit over birthright, and harmonized individual liberty with collective purpose more effectively than previous societies. The fact that a working-class man could become a fighter ace, earning the nation's highest, receiving the nation's highest military award, and then returning home to manage his father's company without fanfare, exemplified the egalitarian character that set America apart from hierarchical societies and totalitarian states. James Sweat never sought to be a symbol. He would have preferred to remain anonymous, another pilot quietly fulfilling his duty. Yet history imposed that symbolism upon him. His Medal of Honor made him publicly visible. His astonishing first mission made him legendary. His modest post-war life made him exemplary. Accepting these roles gracefully became another form of service. When the History Channel invited him to help recreate his combat mission, Sweat could have declined. Instead, he participated completely, providing precise details and ensuring authenticity because he believed younger generations should understand the achievements of those who came before. On a hillside in Northern California, a gravestone marks Colonel James Elm Sweat's final resting place. It lists his name, rank, dates, and Medal of Honor. It does not recount his deeds. The stone is simple, dignified. Nearby rest other veterans, some fallen in battle, some living full lives, all served. The cemetery symbolizes equality in death, where all lie together without distinction. James Sweat would have valued that equality. He never sought special treatment, never demanded recognition for awards. The principles he lived by were simple: do your work well, support your teammates, maintain your equipment, accept responsibility, and honor commitments. These were working-class values learned in machine shops and applied in combat and business with equal effectiveness. They were practical and proven. 88 years after his birth, 66 years after his 15 minutes over Guadalcanal, James Elm Sweat's life concluded. His story endures because it matters, not due to uniqueness, but due to typicality. Thousands of young Americans like Sweat answered their nation's call, performed beyond expectation, and returned home without demanding recognition. They built post-war prosperity, raised families, and contributed to their communities. Their collective achievement was immense. Their personal modesty was remarkable. This combination defined a generation. The ultimate lesson of James Sweat's life is simple. Ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary feats when preparation meets opportunity and courage. Sweat was not superhuman. He was trained, equipped, and motivated. The system prepared him. The situation tested him. His character carried him. The results were remarkable, yet the process was understandable. Any young person with similar training, tools, and character could achieve comparable results. That was the true secret of American success. Not superior humans, but superior systems. Not innate warriors, but trained soldiers properly equipped. Not natural advantages, but developed capabilities. The formula was repeatable and sustainable. It delivered victory in World War II and continued producing success in later challenges. James Elm Sweat passed in 2009 as the last members of the greatest generation gradually left the stage. His death marked the conclusion of one man's journey, yet the legacy of values he embodied endured. Courage and humility, competence and modesty, service and citizenship. These traits remain as relevant now as in 1943. Recognizing James Sweat's achievements honors an entire generation. Studying his life teaches lessons applicable today. Preserving his memory ensures future generations understand the deeds of their predecessors and the principles that sustained them. A working man became a hero. The hero returned to being a working man. The circle was complete. That was the American way. The democratic ideal separating the United States from militaristic societies. Service when needed, humility always, useful work as the highest calling. Colonel James Elm Sweat would have requested nothing more elaborate than this account of his life and service. After all, he had simply done his job to the utmost of his ability, and that proved extraordinary.